So, seid gegrüßt, Freunde. Willkommen zurück zu Let's Play Bioshock. Wobei Let's Play natürlich nicht ganz so sehr bewahrheitet ist. Denn wir schauen uns weiterhin die Kommentare der Regisseure oder des Regisseurs an. Und als nächstes kommt Realitätscheck.
From the moment you boot up Bioshock, you can feel the story grab hold of you. A plane crashes at sea, a mysterious lighthouse, a sprawling city beneath the ocean. Hooking the player from the first touch without overwhelming him with convoluted RPG mechanics was key to the success of the game and the skillful ramping up of Bioshock's legendary gameplay. Bioshock has an amazing opening sequence that I can't imagine the game without it, with the plane and sort of the crash. But I understand that didn't come online until like the very end of development. Sean, is that true?
We had a couple of really depressing playtests. We had built all these systems. We thought we were doing a good job of like giving basically people a playground to play with and things to do. And when we had a playtest, we didn't realize how bad of a job we were doing in exposing those systems to the player, because we were so in these systems and in our own heads, we had no idea that we just weren't facing them towards the player at all. So after that playtest, we took a long, cold look at what we were doing and realized that we had to introduce we were confident enough in the systems that they were going to be fun and meaningful to the player, but we really had to think about how we were going to introduce these systems to the player, and in such a way that they understand why the systems were there. Like, you can't ship a README file with the game and expect people to read it. Like, it has to be part of the experience. So the challenge is, how do you introduce people to these systems, but do it in such a way that it fits within the narrative? So we had to integrate all of these things into the story cleanly so that the player felt like it was one smooth experience. And I think the zap 'em and whack 'em thing was one of those.
And the 1-2 punch.
Yeah, the 1-2 punch that came out of that.
The plane sequence at the beginning, I heard a story that like a programmer put that together in like a day or two, and it was a very last minute thing, right?
It was, so we had done a focus test, and we had it was one of the most depressing experiences of my life, because we were very close to being finished, and it was basically giving people what essentially became the demo, and people played it, and it was in Boston, and we were sort of behind these glass windows, all these sort of Boston guys like, this is a wicked piece of shit. They hated it, and they were making fun of it, and they were saying, it's like watching some guys and dolls beating each other up, and it's the stupidest thing they've ever seen. And we thought we were in pretty good shape at that point. And I remember the focus test guy was like sort of like a doctor giving me the bad news.
Right.
Sorry, Ken, you better get your affairs in order.
Right.
And we all came into work the next day, and we were like, what are we going to do? And we're all pretty depressed, but I think we started talking, and as we talked, we started thinking about, what are they saying to us? What are these people saying to us? We think there's something there. How are they missing it? And we decided that maybe they didn't understand who they were and who their role as a character, who their role in the world was, because the game at that point started with you in the ocean, right, floating in the ocean after the plane crash. And
the crash still was in the fiction, it just wouldn't show.
You just didn't see it, so you didn't have the voiceover saying, my parents always said I was going to do great things or whatever that. They didn't show the plane crash. We didn't establish a time period, because the plane is critical to establishing. You're smoking a cigarette, it's very 1960s looking. All that stuff was established. It wasn't established, so we decided we had no time and no money so we sort of came up with a script. I wrote some lines, a line, I think. Nate, one of our artists, recorded the line. Steven and Sean and those guys got to work on building this very simple sequence, which was relatively simple sequence. And then the plane crash actually happens over the Bioshock logo we already had. But we wrote a radio play behind that with, altitude of the crash. And that, I think, set the emotional, and the people screaming in terror on the plane crash, that set the emotional tenor much better and explained who the player was. And all of a sudden, we released, then I think the next real encounter we had was people playing the demo,
Yeah.
public encounter, and all of a sudden it was a very different experience.
No,
for people.
I remember even back in the day, I think we did a thing on TV where you kind of talked about it, and it was like that night, and I remember that night, like people on the forums were just like going nuts. And even though the game had, I think, had a lot of press attention, when people finally got to play it and go through that sequence, yeah, I just remember there was this mass sort of excitement around it, and then the game shipped only a few weeks after that, right, or a month after that?
A week later, or a few days later.
It's amazing, like now, to hear that, like, literally like a month before the game came out, like the playing sequence came online or something. I mean, it was that late. Right?
And then, yeah, well, we still had to go through certification and all that.
So it's like within,
it wasn't far. It wasn't far. It was really last minute, and it was one of those things where like you really shouldn't be putting in content that late. Yeah. But we felt it. We were so close to having something good that we just rolled the dice on it, and we worked really hard on it. Like we worked really hard. I remember how much time I spent on just that recorded of altitude. I could still hear the different version of that in my head. We spent so much time on that stuff, and these guys were working on getting the animations right and
the scene was shot in engine, but we decided to pre-render it so that we had to do less QA on it.
Right.
It wasn't going to be some like weird streaming error or crash error. Wow. It was just like, we're just going to show the video,
And it's interesting because once you start in the ocean, we had this experience of testing a lot with the water effects and how beautiful Steven's water effects were. People didn't realize they were out of a cutscene at that point. And so they would just sit there and stare, and then they pick up the controller. And they pick up the controller, and all of a sudden they realize they were controlling it. But that, as Sean said, that part of the plane is not actually interactive. It was done in the engine, but we just filmed it.
Now, as people were playing through the game and you were testing it, I'm sure there was debate about, when would you introduce these plasmids, or what would the ramp be? Did that change at all, sort of as you got towards the end of development, about like, oh, we're going to give people the gun at this point, or it's like, we're going to trigger these plasmids at this point? Like, how did that work?
So, like, we moved guns around. Like, for instance, there was a big debate about, originally you found a gun in the lighthouse, a pistol in the lighthouse.
Oh,
at the very
right
beginning.
there,
And because it's a shooter, right? Like, what the hell? And we had a lot of debates about it, and I feel that it was important that we didn't do that, because the fact that you sort of go through a lot of the experience without having the distraction of a gun is important to getting you immersed in the world. Because when you have all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But you don't have the hammer, so you just sort of had to take in the world and have that feeling of fear. And like, I know when you saw that splicer bounding around on the ceiling, that you couldn't do anything about it, and that had even though that's
those are those moments, right? Like I remember when I played Unreal for the first time, where it's like you're trapped and there's a monster and you can't do it, and the lights go out. It's like that's the moment with the splicer where you're like, I want to do something but I can't, and that evokes an emotion.
I remember we kept, moving where the machine gun appeared around and where various plasmids appeared around. It was a real, it's a real fine-tuning process.
Yeah, and it gave us an opportunity, like especially with the shotgun, to really present the weapons, like put some space between them.
It's a moment when you finally.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, we get the shotgun Paul sequence.
Paul Hellquist was he put the sequence together for the when you see the shotgun laying in the pool of light. Like every game developer knows what that means. The minute you pick that thing up, something's going to happen. But it was still a very effective way, as I'm remembering it, to, oh look, I've been waiting for this thing, I'm going to pick it up, and now you have an immediate opportunity to use it. But at the same time, we're trying to ramp up the tension level by having the splicers kind of on the outside of the light, so you can't really see them, and then coming in one at a time and attacking you.
Yeah. And we had very few tools to really control how those splicers acted. So how they were set up and how the environment was lit was really important.
There's even other things like when you get the TK plasmid, I don't think we had a lot of physical space and opportunity and time to really present that. So we came up with the narrative that, it was the doctor's office and he used TK to practice tennis. And we had the turret in there that threw tennis balls at you. So if you wanted to, you could catch the tennis balls and throw them, and you could knock things down. I think it revealed pickups that you could then, pull to yourself with TK. But we're always trying to think of like little backstories that we could do. It doesn't have to be as involved as the shotgun ambush. Sometimes it's just, oh, let's take a grenade turret and turn it into a tennis ball turret.
Because we want to, because I remember like the impulse was, I've been to dentist office, and there's always some like weird aspect of the dentist personality they always want to get through their office. They always have to have their hobby featured in some way, and so we saw an opportunity there to both feature this, he's a tennis nut, and teach TK at the same time.
And
Ich finde es immer wieder interessant, woher die eigentlich ihre Ideen nehmen, ne? Wie viel Zeit sie einfach in dieses Spiel investiert haben, unter welchem Druck etc. Also total krass. Okay, als nächstes eine Welt der Motive.
Rapture is overflowing with memorable locations and set pieces. In developing a world that feels organic, lived in, and functional, Irrational managed to create a space that feels perfectly suited to the story and action that takes place in it, which begs a question: did the plot shape the location, or did the plot fit squarely into a world that was already established? Let's talk about some of the areas in Rapture, because it's an amazing place, but also it feels like there's certain areas that are very well designed and that they have, you know, a very certain aesthetic, and the characters in there, it all kind of comes together. Ken, do you have a part of Rapture that resonates the most with you still to this day?
I think the opening is always going to be the most important to me because it's we spent a lot of time there, and it was all for me as a challenge as a narrative guy is sort of how do we set up a very complex series of events and a very complex notion and all this, you know, Andrew, with so much to tell, Big Daddies and Little Sisters and Andrew Ryan and the time period and do that all without cutscenes. And especially, I think the descent to Rapture when you're in that, when you go in the bathysphere, you know, getting that right, getting everything right down to like, you know, the bathysphere, cresting the hill and seeing the city for the first time. Remember how much we worked on the timing of that, just getting that.
And it took us forever to figure out that we should just put the slide projector covering the window. Like, again, in hindsight, it seems like such an obvious choice, but we were really trying to figure out, like, how are we going to tell this story of Ryan and then reveal so you can see the, you know, the city beyond the hill.
And also we didn't have to show the whole transition going down to the bottom of the ocean because the whole screen was covered.
Spoiler alert.
I think that's the part that will always be near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, I mean, for me it was Kashmir.
Yeah.
That was one of the first...
The restaurant at the beginning.
Yeah, the restaurant at the beginning, because it was really like the first art box that we created that was Rapture. I mean, we created spaces before that weren't really hitting the Art Deco look. Scott Sinclair had just started, and he built that, designed and built that statue of the Atlas with the world on his shoulders that was in the middle of the room. And Mauricio had done some concept art for us of that space. And once we started putting everything together and getting it into Engine and actually walking around it and seeing those giant windows off to the side that just showed the seascape and really drove home the fact that you were underwater. It was the first time really all the elements started to come together.
And we actually we had built a bunch of stuff, and we actually stepped back and said, we have to just get one room right before we go any further, because we weren't getting it right. And so Mauricio did that concept drawing. We worked really hard on that statue, and that statue, I think, was the first object we really built in the game that was a Bioshock. So we just stayed in that room for like a month until we got it right.
And I think the original concept actually had a tram running through it. So it was like even more complicated, and that was one of those things where we had to keep pulling back to really focus on what the bare essence of that room was.
Were there parts of Rapture that you never were able to realize that you sort of still missed? The zoo. People
we had a zoo
Frolic, right?
that I was excited about. Not everybody was excited about the zoo, but I don't know why I was excited about the zoo, because it would have been a nightmare. We had another area that was prior to Arcadia that was more of a straight up agriculture, forest type of area.
Before we had the bathyspheres, we had a whole sort of subway transport system in Rapture, which we spent a lot of time thinking about, and then just realized that these little submersibles would be a much more realistic and much better solution.
And you were going to be able to move between locations in that subway system?
Yeah, much like the bathyspheres, but they were much more integrated throughout the space, and we really want to support them. And we just realized it was not really relevant to what we were doing.
Were there certain locations or areas where you knew a certain narrative point, you know, needed to happen? Like you look at, you know, the reveal of sort of Atlas's true motivations. Like, was that like, oh, we've got to do it this level because it fits the story? Or was it more that you sort of like, you had the game laid out in a certain order and you just layered the story on top of it?
I think the big one I can think of is that you encounter Ryan in his sort of like that he would live in an area of industry.
Okay.
You know, so he lives in this very industrial area because that's where he would feel most comfortable. And that we wanted his office, his lair, to sort of be not in some, you know, residential zone, but where he wants to wake up and smell the grease fires and, you know, and the machines and the smoke. That's in his lifeblood. Industry is his lifeblood.
But it also had to be very theatrical. Like if you look at it now, it doesn't look like an office. You kind of know it's an office because the story is telling you that.
Set, yeah.
And we had some old technology that was laying around in the game that would control environment settings. So old system that we had would let you do high pressure, low pressure, medium pressure. And those would affect lighting and other like post-process things in the world. And that was a system that was cut, but because the code was in, we were always trying to figure out ways to use it. And one of the ways that we used it was in the Andrew Ryan sequence, because we didn't have a lot of narrative storytelling tools. We were basically switching the atmosphere to get all the lighting changes. So whenever a light changes in that scene, we're telling the game that the atmosphere is changing. So, and then the preset atmospheres come in and shine the spotlights on them or bring up the house lights when we need them to.
Because very, very early on, you could change the pressure in the areas, and that would change how explosions worked and all this stuff like that. And we just couldn't figure out how to make it gettable for the player. We couldn't make it feedback, but we still had all those. That moved a lot of levers in the game, so we still had the system. So we used it for the sort of theatrical cues of the, you know, very theatrical cues of Ryan appearing, the lights going down where you are, and the lights coming up where he is, because the engine didn't have those tools by default.
The assassin has overcome my final defense, and now he's come to murder me. In the end, what separates a man from a slave? Money? Power? No. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
And there was a great sense of sort of artistic progression as you went through the game too, and that, you know, each level had its own sort of voice. Was that something that, you know, a lot of games as they move further in development, it's like, oh, we sort of ran out of time. We can, you know, it's like we're just going to sort of repeat this and change the color palette. It felt like, I mean, for the team, it was very defined from early on that you wanted each sort of level, which they were levels back in the day, to feel distinct.
Yeah, I mean, we had sort of experimented with that back on System Shock 2, back when every Doom level looked pretty much like every other Doom level, because they were just sort of working on the same set of assets. We decided with our very rudimentary tools in System Shock 2 that we would progress with color, and every deck would feel different from a color standpoint, even though most of that was lighting, or textures, nothing really more. But we had the tools to actually, you know, sort of theme levels. I think a lot of this goes back to, I think my first memory was actually from when I was 1 year old at the Montreal World Expo.
Remember when you were 1?
Well, I remember being at something at this World's Fair, which I didn't realize, I think was in 1967, when I was 1 year old, a little over 1 year old.
Wow.
And I was on a theme park ride they had and I remember being at this thing where a big bat flies out of this sort of thing and comes up. I don't know why I was a 1 year old was on this ride. I'm not sure, sort of a haunted housey kind of ride. And I remember loving it. And I think that stuck with me. So the notion of sort of theme parky themes and settings, and Disney World does a great job with this. You can go to Disney World, they theme areas. So themed areas are something that always resonated with me. And Bioshock sort of always has had this notion of feeling of theme in different areas, much more than the real world has. Like you walk from building to building, most of them you can't really tell them apart. You walk from you know, walk from a floor of an office building to another floor. It's not going to look any different, but we always felt that was really important.
And there's also, I mean, if you look at SWAT 4, saw some early experiments with this, especially like the serial killer's house level in SWAT 4, which is probably one of the most dense levels that we ship, but you were trying to tell a specific story with that. And going straight into Bioshock and using the same exact engine that we're using, and we were very comfortable at that point with how the engine worked and how to art up these rooms, gave us a leg up when we sat down and really thought about what stories are we specifically trying to tell. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this time period is with Sander Cohen. I think it was Nate Wells and Stephen Alexander sat down one night, and they came up with a backstory for every dead body that you find in that space, and then they told that story with the props that they could. Even if it was just like, this guy crawled 3 feet and then shot himself in the head because he was sad about something. You know, they put those marks in, maybe put a picture next to the guy, and then he shot himself. So they really like did their homework and tried to add, you know, the backstory for everything that you're going to find in that space.
I've got Atlas's goons hitting us non-stop and 2 dead mechanics just this week. We need to control costs. If I wanted to deal with amateurs, I would have stayed on dry land.
Alles klar, als nächstes haben wir die Bewohner Raptures. Vorvorletzte Folge.
Iconic and haunting, the Big Daddy and Little Sisters of Bioshock immediately captivated the public's imagination. Big Daddy encounters defined the Bioshock experience, creating new mechanics and techniques that had not been seen before in gaming. So Big Daddy, Little Sister, such an iconic moment or series of moments in this game. I'm fascinated about how that got layered in, because we talked a lot about the setting and the tone. That is still, to me, you know, a mechanic that I remember was very unique about, you know, choosing to engage the Big Daddy and being a fight that you know is going to be very aggressive and different than a, you know, traditional boss fight. I know you had an idea, Ken, of sort of 3 different types of AIs interacting in the same world.
Yeah, we were sort of like I was trying to think of like AIs you hadn't seen before, and this is still pretty early. Like 10 years ago, a lot's changed in 10 years. So like AIs were still pretty much enemies who saw you and came after you.
Zigzag, shoot.
Yep, and then that was really the focus, is how you make them, you know, use AI better at you, you know. So I started thinking about, are there more primal behaviors to think about? And I was watching a nature show one day, you know, these typical nature shows, and it's like observe the mother tiger taking care of her young, you know, one of those kind of things. And I realized that we don't even need a narrator on those shows. We understand certain behaviors just by looking at them. They're very primal, like somebody protecting their young, the predator-prey behavior. Those things were very, you don't need dialogue for that. And AIs at that point, we didn't have the ability to do a lot of sort of, you know, smart AI. Yeah. So I said, what if their behaviors are just very primal, and we can model those behaviors? So aggro rules is something we knew we can model, right? You know, how does an AI aggro on you? What are the rules for that? Could they make a aggression display rather than just attack? And can another character appear afraid and hide behind the skirts of another character? And we started talking about these things, and the Big Daddy became very quickly, the actual form of the Big Daddy became very quickly as sort of this protector creature. The Little Sister took a lot longer, ironically, even though it's a much simpler notion in a lot of ways. The initial idea came out of sort of watching a nature show, and we're trying to work within our constraints of making, we couldn't make super complex AIs.
Because when we first got the system up and running, this is before the play test, we weren't really thinking about player facing these things. And we had this entire system set up that completely simulated what would happen. And you'd play through the vertical slice and you walk into a room and everybody's dead, because the system would work perfectly. And you weren't there to see the fight. Yeah.
And we track they weren't called Little Sisters at the time, but we track how much they were harvesting, and it was all like a Command and Conquer level simulation.
Yeah.
And players didn't care or notice.
Yep.
And so we just abandoned all that stuff.
Yeah, so that took us a step towards, you know, how do we present this to the player, then how do we make the gatherers, which we called them at the time before Little Sister design came on, like how do we make them empathetic towards the player? How do we make the player want to engage with that? Because at the time they were just slugs.
Right.
So which is a
That's
horrible
right,
design.
Originally were slugs, right?
Yeah.
Not actually.
Which is a horrible design in so many ways, because you don't care about slugs,
Right.
and they're also on the ground, so you don't see them. They're not like at eye level, and they're dark. So
But you still have the trailer had like the same, or not the trailer, the demo, or prototype we did. So had the Big Daddy sort of like interacting with the little slug. And
Slugs crawl around the Big Daddy? Or what?
no, it's this awful
That's a
little
level of
mesh.
sophistication. Yeah.
It's like a little beetle, sort of.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
Yeah.
And they were protecting
And they had
Protecting the beetles.
the beetles? What?
And, no, and
And the
it
Big
was
Daddies
so
had 2 drills.
It's,
they didn't have a hand, so they could. There's no way they could like.
It's just fascinating to me because like the little sister, it's like there's such humanity in it, which really you really connect with.
Which seems like
you would think that would be the obvious thing.
Yeah.
We're not very smart.
The idea of sort of choosing to engage the Big Daddy. I mean, when I was first time I played the game, I mean that was always profound to me because you sort of sit there and like, am I ready for this? And your choice to sort of like, you know, the kind of opposite of stealth, like when you want to be discovered. Was that always the mechanic with the Big Daddy?
Yeah, the idea was that they would have very particular rules about engaging with you that were entirely dependent on how you, the threat level towards, not them, towards their creature they were protecting.
Yeah, that was set, and then as you worked through it, I'm sure there were conversations about how difficult do we make these fights and sort of the balancing of that, and even, you know, with the game, you don't start off with a Big Daddy fight. It's a little ways into the game until you actually get to that. So that was sure debated.
You actually encounter the notion of Big Daddy and Little Sister many times before you actually are freed into an arena where you can actually fight them. You see them
sneaking out, pipes.
You see them. You see them walking down a hall. You see the first time you see Little Sister, she's harvesting, and then you see the Big Daddy come and protect her. And we realized it was 4 or 5 sequences we had to do to set the stage for these characters. And look, we were hoping they'd be iconic and people would respond to the way they did, because we certainly spent energy on them with the expectation that they'd have an impact that we really just as easily could have turned out that nobody cared.
I think the actual very first time, and not a lot of people see it, there's a Little Sister in the event in Kashmir restaurant that if you're looking in the right direction at the right time, you'll see her looking at you, and then she'll disappear into the event.
It's the eyes.
No, it's the actual mesh.
Is it the mesh?
Because it was easier to do that.
Right.
Than new eyes, but yeah.
No, 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 no. Thank you.
The path of the righteous is not always easy.
The thing as you play through the game, you know, I think the moments with those sort of encounters certainly stand out to the player. For you guys, as you were developing it, was there a debate about how often to sort of have those encounters? Like, you know, like how many Big Daddies would there be? How would that play out? I mean, was that something that sort of changed as you?
No, I think we decided there would be 3. I think it was 3 per level.
So 3 and 2 in smaller levels. We did have a third Big Daddy that was mostly finished, but we couldn't make it fun. Like that last 10% of an AI is always like, where's the fun? Like, how do you really make it fun?
I think they put it into Bioshock 2, didn't they?
They might have, yeah.
They might have, I don't know.
But, you know, it was fully rigged, fully animated, but we just didn't have the time we needed to really, really polish it, so we ended up shipping with the bouncer and Rosie.
Hunting the Big Daddy, that demo was a huge moment, I think, in the game's kind of marketing campaign. And that really, I think, you know, sold the tension of that battle. When you showed that, did the entire game feel like that, or was that really more of just like a vertical slice of what you wanted the game to feel like?
That at that point was more what we wanted to feel like, because the Big Daddy was still had a lot of problems at that point. But we were confident we could do that. Like, we wanted to make sure that was an experience we could deliver on. And it was like it functioned, but it would do really weird things. Like, it had this tendency at the time to, if you did the wrong thing, that it would turn into basically a super ball and start like a tiny little super ball. The Big Daddy would go, turn to a super ball and start bouncing or off the ceiling and walls like a million miles an hour. Do you remember why you did that, or what was going on?
I'm sure it was some physics bug that we were,
And so that actually happened. Sometimes we were doing the demo, and Joe Falstick, who was the guy running the demo with me in Barcelona, was very good at making sure that he turned away from the Big Daddy. Like, oh yeah, I guess we killed the Big Daddy. He must be dying over there. But so all things were functional, but they weren't really. They didn't have all their bells and whistles on yet. It was really good for us because it sort of gave us some confidence that people would respond to just the notion of, you know, watching Little Sister and biding your time and choosing your moment.
Well, it gave us confidence, but also gave us a tool that the development team as a whole could gather around and say, we want to make it like this. Like, yes, a lot of elements in that demo were scripted, but they provided a framework for us to go back and how do we make that so it's not scripted? How do we make this robust enough so that the player can actually use these systems?
Yeah.
So it was something that we could point to and say, you know, all right, how are we going to do this? Like, let's break it down and let's figure it out.
And that was like in September, and actually the game was done in The game was done in February, March, so we weren't that far off.
Yeah.
We were, a lot went into it in those final months. But it was a big confidence boost for us because we thought it was the most important thing about the game, besides the world, was this sort of big daddy, little sister concept. And if people didn't care about it, it would have been a problem for us because we spent a lot of time on it.
Alles klar, vorletzte Folge, eine Frage der Moral.
To kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the Bioshock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your Bioshock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of Bioshock's lasting legacy, of course, are the little sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. You know, everyone became a water cooler conversation about like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there was slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was.
Do you salt it? Do you not salt it?
There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the big daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially, or you want to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again. The games press worried a ton about it and wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose. That it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, you do sort of, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up that you. We didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not? Right. And people would tell us stories how their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night. Right. And that's that's an interesting. That was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. This little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right? That has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman. And nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of like, well, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things? As you go through the game, it's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were much more, should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it. Because that's usually the way life is, right? It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of the, once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And that's what, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic constraints.
Or just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with Bioshock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It's really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? This is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving little sisters. Although, I have a few friends that were. I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer and them trying to see, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people. Which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the little sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for bye, Mr. B. Hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
Ich sage ja, die meisten Gamer haben ein gutes Herz. So soll's sein. Okay, letzter Kommentar. Excelsior.
The illusion illusion of choice is a thinly veiled dynamic that drives many single-player gaming experiences. And while many developers spend a lot of time trying to convince players that choice is real and authentic in their games, the truth more often is that choice is a superficial concept in gaming narrative. Bioshock confronted this idea head-on, searing into our minds a innocuous 3-word phrase with an unforgettable new meaning. Would you kindly?
Of course, one of the most memorable moments in the game is the "would you kindly" phrase and the reveal of how that's been motivating the player throughout the entire game. It's still, to me, one of the most classic kind of narrative moments in games in the past decade. What's interesting about that phrase is that it didn't always start like that. Can you tell us sort of about the evolution of sort of the the conditioning of the player? And there was once Excelsior was the phrase once.
Yeah, this is. I'm trying to recall some of this. So we had the idea, because we had the Andrew Ryan scene very early, and we knew sort of all the events that would happen. There were phrases before there was "would you kindly." The notion existed and what it meant and what it was, but we didn't actually have the phrase "would you kindly" until later. So we had a bunch of terms we threw in there. And like Excelsior was it for one point. That's probably comes from my Stan Lee fanboyism.
Was that like so throughout the game? It would have been like Excelsior.
Just randomly say
There are some things when you're making games you just sort of throw in as like, we need
Sounds
something.
cool in
We
a
need
Why don't
something
you head
here.
over there, Excelsior?
And then it sits there for a year.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you kind of forget it's not good, right? And then until somebody comes along and says, dude.
Seriously?
Yeah.
What's
Or you meant
Excelsior?
it to be like a stub in. You never
Right.
meant it to actually gain traction, and then you're like, oh crap.
But that sense of some phrase or word being repeated throughout the game that you wouldn't really realize its meaning until later, that was there very early on.
Yes, yeah. And the fact that you would have something that seemed like a non-thing and then came back at you like a freight train later on was there from pretty early.
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run. Stop. Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
So that phrase evolved, but talk about that, the sort of meta-narrative of, being in a game, thinking that you have a sense of choice and making these decisions, but then obviously realizing that the player ultimately didn't have choice or was conditioned in a way that they would react to that. That was, sort of a new idea for a game. Where did that come from on your side, Ken? I mean, was there sort of a deeper sort of, meaning behind it?
No, look, I think I was always interested in the concept, whether it's, Oedipus, not to get too pointy-headed here, but Oedipus sort of thinking he has, I'm going to leave, this city and go to another city because there's been this prophecy about me and I'm going to avoid my fate and I'm in complete control, and then finding out he's not in control at all, to the Manchurian Candidate, which is a story I love about, somebody who you find out is just a puppet, living a life of a man, and Fight Club. I always love those kind of stories about who am I and what is my agency in this world, because look, we struggle. I think everybody struggles that. How much we really have control over, and how much is our boss or parents or whatever telling us what to do. So that seemed like a natural thing for a story, and because it came from movies, that idea a lot, and plays. I don't think it was very. There was a lot of. It hadn't been explored in games really, and games are particularly interesting because games.
Because you feel like you are interacting with choice,
And you're really being, most games, especially at the time, you're really just being railroaded down a corridor. It's very easy to underestimate gamers, and I think probably I did a little of my own underestimation there, that it would be a little too pointy-headed for people, but people seem to really engage, probably because it spoke to an experience they had, a struggle as a gamer they've always had, which is like, I want to control, but how much control do I really have in this game?
True. And Sean, I mean, it was also something that, was a great surprise when you played through the game. And I'm sure even for people on the team, did everyone know that when Ken was sort of doing it, or did it was revealed as people played through it?
I think, at some point the entire team knew. It wasn't, it was something that was talked about with a smaller group before it was bought to the entire team. Early on, when you heard the idea and you just kind of clicks, right? You're like, okay, like I totally get this.
Did
like,
people get it? I seem to remember people looking at me like I was like a lunatic.
Maybe not the specifics, and maybe it's the Excelsior, or you may be talking about the Excelsior time, but the idea that you don't really have choice, and exactly like you said, you played through how many video games, and everybody's game is going to end the same way. You're going to kill these people, you're going to pass through these checkpoints, and you think you have a choice, but ultimately the only real choice is stop playing the game. So the idea that we're kind of like taking that on resonated. Now the actual, like, is it Excelsior, or is it the Latin phrase I forgot, or if it's would you kindly?
See, here's how I remember it, and I could be, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I can remember being so surprised by the outside reaction, because I remember the internal reaction being completely nobody connected or engaged to it. I mean, we worked on it.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of surprised by the outside reaction, because I kind of thought it was like, as I said, it's a bit academic, right?
Yeah.
And look, it also could be a function of
we're playing it close to the vest.
I could be misremembering it, or it could also just be a function of nobody making the game had the experience of playing it through and getting to that moment.
That's what I mean. Like, it was revealed to them in advance of really playing it, so it wasn't that surprise.
Yeah, they had seen it in all its really half-assed, development stages on the way.
Out of order.
Yeah, out of order and all that.
And it's not really something you can play test over an afternoon, because it takes a little while to get to that point.
You need to lack the knowledge about what the game is to be able to sort of have that experience all the way through. I know you guys have talked about the idea of Atlas, the voice actor changing, and it was, I guess, very important that you nailed that actor, right? And you trusted that actor until there was sort of the Fontaine reveal and sort of understanding that.
Yeah, trust was everything there, right? And so there was something about either the actor or the writing or the accent that just people immediately said, this guy's no good.
Right.
When the first Atlas we had, because you have to trust this guy, and if you don't, there's no trust. There's no, there's no punch in the gut. I think we've really focused on making him have personal stakes in the story as well. That he had his family trapped. Of course, it was all fiction, right? But his he had skin in the game. He sort of spoke to you as a friend, and especially because the whole world was so hostile to you. I think it took a while to get that exactly right.
Listen, I've got a family. I need to get them out of here. But the splicers have cut me off from them. If you can reach them in Neptune's bounty, then maybe, just maybe. I know you must feel like the unluckiest man in the world right now, but you're the only hope I'll ever see my wife and child again.
Sean, what do you hope is the kind of lasting legacy of Bioshock? 10 years hence, a lot of things you guys were doing, have sort of become common now, right? With upgrades and moral choices in games and whatnot. But it was really pioneering work a decade ago. When you reflect on it, what do you hope people remember the game for sort of pushing forward?
For me, it's telling a story with the medium and how we used everything available to us to tell that story. We used the environment to set up the backstory of Rapture and really create a sense of space, which I think is vitally important to getting the players to trust that, to sit down and kind of like just be in the space and let these things happen. Even the radio logs, the rudimentary animation that we had at the time. I mean, we really sat down with the tools that we had and at our disposal and tried to tell a meaningful story. Maybe not meaningful, but something that would be memorable to people that they could take away and, like you said earlier, have that water cooler moment where they're excited enough to talk about it after they put the controller down. So for me, I think the legacy is that it was a story well told.
For me, it was a sense of place, being like the Rapture is a real thing, even though it's not. It's actually a very crude, from the time, a relatively crude bunch of polygons and texture maps. It's only, the original game is only in 720, I think. And I played a lot of it when we were testing it on a 14-inch, SD television. That it still felt like a sense of place in the music and the characters, that it's a real place. And I think that my memories of the Bioshock games is that I take away that Rapture's a real place and Elizabeth's a real person. Those are the two sort of big things that stick with me with those two games. And that's sort of what I'll always, carry forward with me in my life.
Bioshock is, it's a place, but as we saw with Infinite, I mean, it's an idea, and it's a sort of a type of game. I think a lot of people say, like, oh, this is a type of experience. When you think about, your career, where you guys want to go, I mean, that idea of those types of games, do you miss it now that you've sort of moved on to other things now, or do you feel like it's sort of, you've closed that chapter?
I mean, it's always a part of what you do. Like, System Shock 2 was a part of Bioshock. But it wasn't System Shock 2. It was you're growing past that and trying out new things. I think Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, and even going back to SWAP 4, those will always be a part of my experience as a game developer and what we're trying to do with the medium. So I don't think it's something that you just draw a line and say, we'll never return, because there's always lessons that you can learn and things that you bring with you to the next project that you're working on.
Yeah. I don't think the new game is gonna, people are not gonna be surprised that this game is new games from us. They're gonna see a lot of what we had done before in terms of world building and aspects of storytelling. The goal is to sort of, move away from the you really have no choice kind of thing, and that's a very, 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 very hard problem, which we spent years working on. But we're building upon a foundation of stuff we've done before, just trying to go in a different direction with it. But it's always going to be part of our DNA.
City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
So, letzter Kommentar, auch durch. Also im Großen und Ganzen, also unglaublich viele Infos. Ich glaube, das ganze Interview, also alles zusammen, das ging fast 2 Stunden. Also richtig, richtig krass. Und teilweise hatte ich so, trotz der informativen Argumente und Erzählungen seitens der Entwickler, also von Sean und Ken, irgendwie so teilweise so ein bisschen das Gefühl einzuschlafen, weil die haben so ein bisschen so eine ich weiß nicht, so eine Einschlafmentalität. Also ich weiß auch nicht, also die wirkten sehr ruhig, sehr ausgeglichen, teilweise doch irgendwie wiederum aber auch sehr sachlich, sehr, sehr seriös und ja, vor allem informativ. Und dennoch wirkten sie auch auf irgendeine Art und Weise doch sehr, sehr ernst. Also es kam irgendwie kaum so irgendwelche Jokes dazwischen, ne? So irgendwas, das Ganze so ein bisschen aufgepeppt hat von der Stimmung. Aber das war ja auch nicht das, was eigentlich so rüberkommen sollte, sondern mehr die Infos, wie sie das Spiel entwickelt haben. Und da haben sie meiner Meinung nach wirklich, wie auch eben schon gesagt wird, wurde Pionierarbeit geleistet, denn sie haben ganz viele Elemente mit reingebracht, die zwar heute gang und gäbe sind, aber die es früher halt in der Form so nicht gab, beziehungsweise gar nicht gab. Und also wirklich, wenn man sich also das Interview hat mir letztendlich gezeigt, so einen kleinen Ausschnitt, ne, aus dem Leben eines Spielentwicklers. Für viele ist es ja ein Traumberuf, klar, ist auch logisch, Spielentwickeln macht Spaß, aber man hat auch gemerkt, mit wie viel Arbeit, die da rangegangen sind, mit wie viel Druck vor allem halt, ne? Also die Publisher suchen, Ideen sammeln, sind die gut, sind die schlecht, wie kommen die an, so kleine Feinheiten wie Akzente etc. Also echt Respekt, also das ist, also ich zollte ihm wirklich meinen Respekt, ne? Also schon krass und bewundernswert. Ja, ich vermute mal, es werden 3 Bonusparts, ja. Ich hätte ja nicht gedacht, dass das so lang gehen würde. Ich weiß nicht, ob jetzt der nächste Part, der nächste Bonuspart der letzte Bonuspart sein wird oder der vorletzte. Das werden wir dann sehen, wenn wir das Museum und die zusätzlichen Inhalte gemeinsam machen werden. Und ihr dürft mir gerne euer Feedback zu den Kommentaren beziehungsweise zu diesem Interview schreiben. Das würde mich sehr interessieren. Wie ihr das so findet, wie eure Meinung ist und einfach euer Feedback dalassen. Das wäre eine Herrlichkeit. Ja, und ich würde sagen, wir sehen uns dann möglicherweise im letzten Bonuspart von Bioshock Remastered wieder. Also haut rein, bis dann und ciao.